Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're exploring the remarkable life of John D. Rockefeller, from poverty to becoming the richest man in history. Let me know in the comments where in the world are you listening from. Now get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. In the year 1839, in the small town of Richford, New York, a settlement of fewer than 1,000 souls, a boy was born who would one day command the attention of the entire nation. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, and he entered a world of humble farmers, modest homes, and limited prospects. The Rockefeller family lived simply, as did most in their community. They grew what they could. They mended what broke. They made do with what little they had. The farmhouse was small and drafty, with gaps in the walls that let in the bitter New York winter. The family wore clothes that showed every patch and stitch, hand-me-downs worn thin by use and time. But even among the modest circumstances of rural America, there was something unusual about the Rockefeller household, something that would shape young John in ways both profound and troubling. The source of this peculiarity was John's father, a man known throughout the region by a nickname that spoke volumes, Devil Bill. William Avery Rockefeller was by all accounts a fascinating and frustrating figure. He was charming when he wanted to be, talented in his own peculiar way, and utterly unreliable in all the ways that mattered most to a family trying to survive on the edge of poverty, where other fathers worked their farms from dawn until dusk. Bill pursued a bewildering array of interests and occupations. He fancied himself an athlete, displaying feats of strength at county fairs. He practiced ventriloquism, throwing his voice to amuse and confuse his neighbors. He was a skilled hunter, bringing home game when the mood struck him. He even dabbled in hypnotism, claiming powers that made the more superstitious locals wary. Once he won a bear in a competition, an enormous creature that he brought back to the farm like a strange trophy. To the amazement and alarm of everyone who witnessed it, Bill trained that bear to perform tricks, as if it were a dog or a horse. The bear became something of a local legend, as did its master, a man who seemed to operate by rules known only to himself. But it wasn't these eccentricities alone that earned Bill his devilish reputation. What truly marked him in the community's memory, what made him a source of both fascination and disapproval, was his habit of vanishing. Bill would disappear in the middle of the night, slipping away without warning or explanation, leaving his wife Eliza and their growing family to manage the farm and fend for themselves. Sometimes he would be gone for weeks, sometimes for months. The family would wake one morning to find him simply gone, as if he had never been there at all. Young John would watch his mother's face grow drawn with worry as the days stretched into weeks without word. He would feel the weight of responsibility settling on shoulders far too young and narrow to bear it. At an age when other boys were playing and exploring, John was learning to be the man of the house, helping his mother work the land, caring for his younger siblings, trying to hold together a family that seemed always on the verge of coming apart. And then, just as mysteriously as he had departed, Bill would return. He would arrive in a fine carriage, dressed in clothes too expensive for any farmer, his pockets full of money, his arms laden with gifts and treats for the children. The humble farmhouse would briefly transform into a scene of abundance and celebration. There would be toys, sweets, new clothes, things the family had never been able to afford during his absence. John and his siblings would delight in their father's return, their faces bright with joy at the unexpected bounty. But even as he accepted the gifts, even as he felt the momentary relief of his father's presence, young John struggled to understand the stark contrast between these fleeting moments of plenty and the grinding poverty they otherwise endured. For a child, this was a confusing and painful existence. The family lived in a house that needed constant repair, its roof leaking with every rain, its floors worn and uneven. They went to bed hungry more often than not, the pantry bare, the coming winter a source of dread. The cold seeped through those gaps in the walls, and there was never quite enough wood for the fire, never quite enough food for the table. And yet, periodically, inexplicably, there would be these glimpses of a different life, a life their father seemed to inhabit somewhere else, in some other world they couldn't see or understand. Where did the money come from? How could a man who left his family in such desperate straits return with such apparent wealth? What did he do during those long absences? The truth, which young John wouldn't fully understand until he was much older, was that Bill Rockefeller lived a secret double life. When he vanished from Richford, he didn't simply disappear, he transformed. William Rockefeller became Dr. William Livingston, a traveling medicine man who moved from town to town selling herbal remedies and elixirs to the sick and desperate. These remedies were, by all accounts, useless. They cured nothing. They were concoctions of roots and alcohol, given impressive names and sold with impressive claims. But Bill, or Dr. Livingston as he called himself, was a talented showman and a convincing liar. He would arrive in a new town, set up his travelling show, and persuade people desperate for relief from their ailments to part with their hard-earned money. In essence, Bill was a con artist, a fraudster who preyed on the hopes of the suffering. The money he brought home to his family, the money that paid for those brief celebrations and expensive gifts, came from deception. It was built on the misery of others, on false promises and shattered hopes. And there was more. In those distant towns where no one knew the name Rockefeller, Bill was free to be whoever he chose to be. He could craft any identity, tell any story, live any life, and apparently at some point he decided that one family was not enough. Years later it would be discovered that Bill, using his alias of Dr. Livingston, had married another woman in a different state. He maintained this second household in complete secrecy. Neither his first wife nor his second knew of the other's existence. Bill moved between these two lives, these two families, like an actor changing costumes between performances. For young John, growing up in this atmosphere of uncertainty and mystery, the lessons were harsh but formative. He learned that the world was not a fair or predictable place. He learned that authority figures, even parents, could not always be trusted or relied upon. He learned that security was fragile, that comfort could vanish in an instant, and that the only person he could truly depend on was himself. But he also learned something else, something that would shape his character in ways he might not have recognized at the time. He learned the value of stability, of consistency, of being present and reliable. In watching his father's failures, he absorbed lessons about what kind of man he did not want to become. John began to take pride in being dependable. When his mother needed help, he was there. When his siblings needed care, he provided it. He was still a child himself, but circumstances had forced him to grow up quickly, to shoulder burdens that should have belonged to his father, and in those quiet moments when the work was done and the family was asleep, perhaps John looked up at the stars above that humble farmhouse and wondered about his future. He was just a poor boy in a small town, with a family name that carried more shame than pride. The prospects seemed dim, the path forward unclear, but within him, shaped by hardship and absence, was forming a character of remarkable determination, a drive not just to escape poverty, but to build something solid and lasting, a hunger not just for wealth, but for security and control over his own destiny. And from these humble and uncertain beginnings, a remarkable journey would slowly unfold. When John was 10 years old, an event occurred that would force the Rockefeller family to uproot their lives once again. Devil Bill, whose secret double life had remained hidden from the wider community, found himself accused of a crime that would bring unwanted attention to the family name. A young woman in the area came forward with allegations that Bill had sexually assaulted her. The accusations were serious, and though nothing was ever proven in a court of law, the mere whisper of such charges in a small, tight-knit community was enough to destroy a family's reputation. In those days, in those places, reputation was everything. A family's standing in the community determined their access to credit, to trade, to the basic social networks that made survival possible. Once tainted by scandal, whether the accusations were true or false, a family could find themselves isolated, shunned, unable to make a living or maintain their dignity. Eliza Rockefeller, John's mother, made the difficult decision to leave. She gathered her children, packed what few possessions they owned, and moved the family away from Richford, seeking a fresh start in a place where the Rockefeller name carried no shame, where they might rebuild their lives away from judging eyes and wagging tongues. One might have expected that after such a crisis, Bill would reform his ways, would recognize the damage his behavior had caused, and commit himself to being the husband and father his family needed. But Bill was not a man given to reflection or change. If anything, the scandal seemed to liberate him, to confirm his belief that he owed nothing to conventional morality or social expectations. And so, even as the family tried to build a new life, Bill's absences grew longer and more frequent. He maintained his traveling medicine show, continuing to sell his useless remedies under the name Dr. Livingston. And at some point during these years, he committed an act that would remain hidden from his first family for decades. Using his false identity, he married another woman. This second wife knew nothing of Eliza and the children in New York. She believed herself to be Dr. Livingston's only spouse, his legitimate wife. Meanwhile, Eliza knew nothing of this other woman, this other household that Bill maintained somewhere in the vast expanse of the growing nation. He moved between these two lives with apparent ease, compartmentalizing his existence in a way that suggested either remarkable coldness or a complete absence of conscience. For John, now approaching his teenage years, his father's near-total absence became simply a fact of life. Bill was not there to teach him to farm, to hunt, to do the work that fathers typically passed on to their sons. Bill was not there to guide him, to discipline him, to shape his character through example and instruction. Instead, John learned from his mother. Eliza Rockefeller was a woman of deep religious faith, a devout Baptist who found strength and solace in her beliefs. She instilled in her children a strong moral framework, a sense of right and wrong that would stay with John throughout his life, even as he made choices that others would question or condemn. Eliza taught John the value of hard work, of persistence, of doing one's duty, regardless of the difficulty or the cost. She taught him that the world owed him nothing, that anything worth having must be earned through discipline and effort. These lessons, learned while ploughing fields and mending fences, while caring for younger siblings and managing the household in his father's absence, became the foundation of John's character. But John was not content merely to work the farm and help his mother survive. Even as a young boy, he showed an entrepreneurial spirit, a creativity in finding ways to earn money that set him apart from other children his age. One of his earliest ventures came about almost by accident. John was walking through the woods one day when he spotted a wild turkey. He followed it quietly, carefully, until he discovered its nest. Instead of simply taking the eggs for food, John had a different idea. He collected the eggs, brought them home, and patiently tended to them until they hatched. He raised those turkey chicks with care, feeding them, protecting them from predators, watching them grow into mature birds. When they were fully grown, he sold some of them to neighbors, earning a tidy profit from his patience and foresight. But he was smart enough to keep some of the turkeys, allowing them to lay more eggs, which could produce more turkeys, creating a sustainable cycle of income. It was a small operation, perhaps even trivial in the grand scheme of things. But it demonstrated something important about young John's mind. He understood the concept of investment, of delayed gratification, of using current resources to create future opportunities. These were sophisticated ideas for a child, but they came naturally to him, born perhaps from the necessity of living in a household where every penny mattered. Soon, John was contributing a few dollars every week to the family's finances. It wasn't much, but in a household as poor as the Rockefellers, it made a real difference. It meant the difference between going hungry and having food on the table. It meant the difference between freezing and having enough wood for the fire. More than the money itself, these early business ventures gave John something he desperately needed, a sense of agency, a feeling that he had some control over his circumstances. He couldn't control his father's comings and goings, He couldn't control the family's poverty or their precarious position in society, but he could control his own efforts, his own ingenuity, his own contribution to the family's survival. For a time it seemed that perhaps the Rockefeller family might finally find some stability. They had settled in a new community. John was helping to provide for the household. His mother maintained her quiet strength and faith. The younger children were growing. Despite all the hardships, despite Bill's failures and absences, the family was surviving. But then came another uprooting, another move. The Rockefeller family found themselves traveling again, this time to Oswego, New York, and then to Owego, and finally to Strongsville, Ohio. Each move driven by Bill's schemes or scandals, or simply by the family's desperate search for a place where they might build a stable life. With each move, John took on more responsibility. He was no longer just helping his mother. He was effectively serving as the head of the household. He managed the family's limited finances. He negotiated with shopkeepers and landlords. He made decisions that should have been his father's to make. By the time he was in his early teens, John had acquired a maturity and sense of responsibility that many adults never achieved. Through all of this constant upheaval, John somehow managed to continue his education. He attended school whenever and wherever he could. Though his attendance was irregular and often interrupted by the family's moves or by the need to work, he learned reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. More importantly, he developed a love of learning, an understanding that education was a tool, a way to improve one's circumstances and opportunities. By 1853, when John was 14 years old, the family had finally settled in Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland was not the small rural village that Richford had been. It was a growing city benefiting from its strategic location on Lake Erie and its connection to the expanding network of canals and railroads that were transforming American commerce. In Cleveland, opportunities existed that had never been available in the small farming communities where John had grown up. There were businesses, banks, merchants, manufacturers. There was a bustling economy, money changing hands, fortunes being made. For a young man with ambition and intelligence, Cleveland represented possibility. John was now 16 years old and approaching the end of his formal schooling. He began to think seriously about his future, about what kind of life he wanted to build for himself. He had watched his father squander opportunities and talents through irresponsibility and deception. He had seen his mother endure hardship with grace and faith. From these contrasting examples, he was forming his own vision of who he wanted to be. He knew he wanted stability. He wanted security. He wanted to build something solid and lasting, something that could not be taken away by circumstance or scandal. And perhaps most of all, he wanted to prove that a boy from poverty, from a broken and troubled family, could rise above his origins and make something of himself. In his mind, a plan was forming. In his heart, an ambition was growing. The lessons of those difficult years, the hard-won wisdom earned through poverty and responsibility, were shaping him into someone formidable, someone driven, someone who would let nothing stand between him and his goals. And the next chapter of his life was about to begin. At 16 years old, in the spring of 1855, John D. Rockefeller faced a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He was approaching the end of his formal education at Central High School in Cleveland, and the question of what came next pressed upon him with increasing urgency. In an ideal world, John would have gone on to college. He was bright, capable, and hungry for knowledge. Higher education would have opened doors, provided connections, given him advantages that his poverty had denied him. But the world John lived in was far from ideal, and the realities of his family's situation made such dreams impossible. By this time, John had not just one or two siblings, but 4 brothers and sisters who depended on the family's meager resources. And Eliza was pregnant again, soon to bring a 5th child into their struggling household. With Bill still largely absent, still living his double life and contributing little to nothing to the family's support, the burden of providing for this growing family fell increasingly on John's young shoulders. Eliza relied on her eldest son. She needed him to work, to earn money. to help keep the family fed and housed. College was an unaffordable luxury, a dream that would have to be deferred indefinitely, or perhaps abandoned altogether. John understood this, accepted it without bitterness or complaint. It was simply the reality of his circumstances. And so, 2 months before he would have graduated from high school, John made the practical decision to leave school and enter the workforce. There was no graduation ceremony for him, no celebration of academic achievement. There was only the quiet understanding that duty called, and he would answer. But if John had to work, he was determined to find work worthy of his abilities and ambitions. He wasn't going to settle for manual labor or farm work. He wanted something better, something that would use his mind rather than just his back, something that might lead somewhere beyond mere survival. He drew up a list, methodical and organized even in his job search. On that list were the names of the largest and most prominent businesses in Cleveland, the major railroads, the most established banks, the biggest wholesale merchants. These were the institutions that mattered in the city's economy, the places where real business was conducted, where a young man might learn valuable skills and make important connections. Day after day, John made his rounds, presenting himself at one business after another. He dressed as well as his limited wardrobe allowed. He practiced his manners, his speech, his presentation. He was polite, respectful, eager. He explained that he was looking for work, that he was good with numbers, that he was reliable and willing to learn. And day after day, he was turned away. When potential employers saw this thin, earnest 16-year-old boy standing before them, they laughed. They dismissed him out of hand. He was too young, they said. He had no experience. He had no college education, not even a high school diploma. What could he possibly offer a serious business? The rejections stung, but John refused to be deterred. Each morning he would review his list, identify the next business to visit, and set out again. He developed a thick skin, learning to accept the laughter and dismissal without letting it show on his face or dampen his determination. Every rejection was simply one step closer to acceptance, one more business crossed off the list, one more opportunity to practice his presentation. 6 weeks passed this way. 6 weeks of daily rejections, of doors closing in his face, of men barely glancing at him before waving him away. For many people, such sustained failure would have been crushing. It would have driven them to give up, to settle for whatever lesser work they could find. But John had learned patience from raising those turkeys, persistence from working the unforgiving soil of his family's farms. He had learned that worthwhile things take time, that the path to success is rarely straight or smooth. And finally, on September 26, 1855, his persistence paid off. He found himself in the offices of Hewitt and Tuttle, a small produce commission firm that bought and sold agricultural goods. The partners, Isaac Hewitt and Henry Tuttle, were looking for help with their bookkeeping. The business was growing, and they needed someone to manage their accounts, track their transactions, handle the paperwork that was overwhelming them. When John walked in that morning, the partners were willing to at least talk to him. Perhaps they were more desperate than the larger firms. Perhaps they saw something in his earnest demeanor that impressed them. Or perhaps it was simply John's moment, the convergence of preparation and opportunity that would change his life. He sat down with them and demonstrated his skills. His penmanship was excellent, neat and precise. His understanding of numbers was solid. He had taught himself the basics of bookkeeping during his years of managing his family's limited finances. When Hewitt and Tuttle saw his careful columns of figures, his organized approach to record keeping, they were impressed. They made him an offer on the spot. "Start immediately," they told him. "Get to work right away. We need the help." They were so eager to bring him on board that they didn't even mention what they would pay him. John, overjoyed to finally have a position, didn't think to ask. He simply accepted, thanked them profusely, and threw himself into the work. That date, September 26th, became sacred to John. For the rest of his life he would celebrate it as Job Day, marking it on his calendar, and observing it with more enthusiasm than he showed for his own birthday. To John, this day represented something more important than the accident of his birth. It represented the moment when his real life began, when he took his first step toward independence and success, when he proved that persistence and determination could overcome poverty and circumstance. The work at Hewitt & Tuttle was not glamorous, but John found it fascinating. He was learning how real business worked, seeing the inner mechanisms of commerce that had always been hidden from him. He learned how farmers brought their produce to commission firms like Hewitt & Tuttle. He saw how these firms then sold that produce to grocers and merchants, taking a percentage of each transaction. He began to understand supply and demand, profit margins, the importance of timing and relationships in business dealings. Every day brought new lessons. He learned how to negotiate with suppliers, how to extend credit carefully, how to collect debts without losing customers. He learned the importance of meticulous record keeping, of knowing exactly where every penny went, of being able to account for every transaction. These skills might have seemed mundane, but they were the foundation of business, and John absorbed them with the intensity of a dedicated student. One day, his employers came in with a check for $4,000, an enormous sum of money. They placed it in the office safe and went about their business. John knew the combination to that safe. It was part of his responsibilities to access it when needed. And that day, when his bosses were gone, he couldn't resist the temptation. He opened the safe, took out the check, and simply held it in his hands. $4,000, more money than his family had seen in their entire lives. He stared at the numbers, trying to comprehend what such wealth would mean, the houses it could buy, the food it could provide, the security and comfort it represented. He wasn't tempted to steal it. That thought never crossed his mind. He just wanted to hold it, to feel the weight of that much money in his hands, to make it real in some tangible way. And as he held that check, a dream crystallized in his mind. Someday, he promised himself, he would have this kind of money. Not $4,000, but more. Much more. He would build wealth that would protect him and his family from the poverty and instability that had defined his childhood. He would never have to watch his mother worry about where the next meal would come from. He would never have to feel powerless in the face of circumstance. From that day forward, John began a practice that would stay with him throughout his life. Every morning before leaving for work, he would stand before a mirror and repeat to himself, "I am bound to be rich. I am bound to be rich." It was part affirmation, part prayer, part declaration of intent. He was programming his mind, reinforcing his determination, refusing to let doubt or fear diminish his ambition. At the end of 1855, on the last day of the year, Hewitt & Tuttle finally told John what they would pay him for his work. The total for the entire year came to $50, broken down by day. It meant he had been earning about 50 cents for each day's labor. It was almost nothing, far less than what many common laborers made. For months of dedicated work, of long hours and careful effort, he had earned barely enough to make a modest contribution to his family's needs. Another person might have been insulted, might have felt exploited or undervalued, but John understood that he had received something more valuable than money in those early months. He had received an education in business, training that no school could have provided. He had proven himself capable and reliable, and his employers, recognizing his value, raised his salary to $300 per year for the coming year, roughly equivalent to $11,000 in today's money. This raise was transformative for John and his family. $300 a year was enough to make a real difference. Combined with his mother's careful management, it meant the family could finally achieve something approaching stability. They could pay their rent reliably. They could keep food on the table. They could face the future with less fear and more hope. But perhaps most importantly for John himself, this income gave him something he had never had before: independence from his father. He no longer needed to hope for Bill's sporadic and unreliable contributions. He no longer had to depend on a man who had proven himself utterly undependable. John was now the provider, the one his family could count on, and that responsibility, though heavy, brought with it a sense of pride and purpose. And there was something else John did with his modest income, something that revealed the depth of his mother's influence and the religious faith she had instilled in him. From that very first paycheck, John gave approximately 10% of his earnings to his church and to various charitable causes. This practice of tithing, of giving away a portion of his income to help others, would continue throughout his life, even as the sums involved grew from pennies to millions of dollars. And so, as 1855 gave way to 1856, John D. Rockefeller was establishing the patterns and principles that would guide him through the decades ahead. Hard work, careful record-keeping, relentless determination, faith in both God and himself, and an unwavering belief that poverty was not destiny, that circumstances could be overcome, that a better future could be built through discipline and effort. The foundation was being laid, stone by stone, day by day, and what would eventually rise from that foundation would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. For 2 years, John worked diligently at Hewitt & Tuttle, learning the rhythms and patterns of the produce business. He arrived early each morning, stayed late into the evening, and absorbed every lesson the work offered. He learned to read the subtleties of the market, to understand when to buy and when to sell, to recognize opportunity in the constant flow of agricultural goods through Cleveland's bustling commercial district. During those years, he became friendly with a young man named Maurice Clark, who worked down the street at another business. Maurice was about 10 years older than John, a chemist by training, but like many ambitious men of that era, he was drawn to the possibilities of commerce and trade. The two young men would cross paths regularly as they went about their business, and gradually a friendship developed. They discovered they shared similar temperaments and ambitions. Both were serious, hard-working, and eager to build something of their own. Both had grown up with limited means and understood the value of opportunity, and both had begun to see the limitations of working for others, no matter how valuable the experience might be. John was now 18 years old, still young by most measures, but he carried himself with a maturity that made people forget his age. His 2 years at Hewitt & Tuttle had given him a reputation in Cleveland's business community as someone reliable and capable. When he spoke about business matters, people listened. When he made a commitment, people trusted him to follow through. And so when Maurice approached him one day with a proposal, John was ready to listen. Maurice had been thinking about starting his own business, he explained. A produce commission house, similar to Hewitt & Tuttle, but independent, owned and operated by partners who would share in the profits rather than working for wages. He believed there was room in Cleveland's growing market for another firm, especially one run by young men who were willing to work harder and smarter than the established players. The idea appealed to John immediately. He had learned as much as he could from his current position. He understood the business well enough to run his own operation, and the thought of being his own master, of building something that belonged to him rather than enriching someone else, was deeply attractive. But starting a business required capital, and capital was something John still lacked. His salary at Hewitt & Tuttle, while adequate for supporting his family and allowing him to save a modest amount, was not nearly enough to fund a new venture. He had managed to save about $800 through careful economy and discipline, but that was far short of what would be needed. For the first time in his life, John did something that would have been unthinkable to him in earlier years. He asked his father for help. Despite everything, despite the years of absence and disappointment, despite the shame and instability Bill had brought to the family, John swallowed his pride and approached Devil Bill for a loan. Perhaps Bill saw this as a chance to redeem himself, to finally do something for the son who had stepped into the role he had abandoned. Or perhaps he simply saw it as a business opportunity, a chance to earn interest on money that might otherwise sit idle. Whatever his motivation, Bill agreed to lend John $1,000 at 10% interest, a rate that was steep but not unreasonable for the time. With John's savings and Bill's loan, the partners had enough to begin. In 1858, Clark and Rockefeller opened for business. The name was deliberately chosen. placing Clark's name first as a nod to his greater age and experience, but the partnership was equal. They would share the work, share the risks, and share the profits. The early days were challenging, but exhilarating. They rented a small office and threw themselves into the work with a passion born of ownership. This was theirs. Every decision they made, every success or failure, belonged to them. There were no bosses to answer to, no owners to please. They were building something from nothing, and that realization brought with it a sense of purpose and excitement that mere employment could never match. The work itself was grueling. They spent long days on the road, traveling to farms and small towns throughout the region, meeting with farmers and small producers, negotiating prices for their grain and produce. They would buy wagon loads of wheat, corn, beans, and other agricultural goods, then transport them back to Cleveland, where they would sell them to grocers and merchants at a markup. It was hot, dusty, exhausting work. The roads were rough, the travel slow and uncomfortable. Negotiations could be difficult, with farmers trying to get the highest price for their goods, while John and Morris tried to leave themselves enough margin to make a profit. But both young men were willing to do whatever was necessary. They were building a foundation, establishing relationships, proving themselves in the market. At first, John's quiet demeanor worked against him. He was not naturally boisterous or aggressive, not the kind of salesman who could dominate a conversation or overwhelm someone with personality. But he had other qualities that served him well in business. He was honest and straightforward in his dealings. He kept his word. He paid his bills promptly, and he had a genuine ability to listen, to understand what the other party needed, to find ways to make deals that worked for everyone involved. Farmers and merchants began to trust him. They appreciated his quiet competence, his reliability, his lack of flashy salesmanship. When John Rockefeller made a commitment, they knew he would honor it. When he quoted a price, they knew it was fair. And so gradually, Clark and Rockefeller built a reputation and a client base. The business grew, but it faced a constant challenge that plagued all small enterprises: the need for capital. To buy goods from farmers, they needed cash in hand, but they often had to wait weeks or even months to receive payment from the merchants to whom they sold those goods. This gap between paying out and receiving payment created a perpetual need for credit and working capital. John and Maurice developed a clever strategy to address this problem. When they wanted to secure a loan from a bank, they would make sure to be seen around Cleveland talking about larger sums of money than they actually needed. They would mention casually in conversation that they were looking to invest $10,000, when in fact they only needed $5,000. This created an impression of prosperity and abundance that made banks more willing to extend credit. It was a small deception perhaps, but an effective one in an era when reputation and appearance often mattered as much as actual assets. The banks, convinced that Clark and Rockefeller had substantial resources, were happy to lend them the money they needed to keep growing, and John always made sure those loans were repaid promptly, building a credit history that would serve him well in years to come. And then, in April of 1861, the nation was plunged into crisis. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the American Civil War began. It was a moment of profound uncertainty and fear. No one knew how long the conflict would last or how it might reshape the country. Businesses faced an unknown future. Would the war disrupt trade? Would it destroy the economy? Would young men like John and Maurice be called to fight? John was deeply opposed to slavery on moral and religious grounds. His mother had raised him with strong Baptist convictions about the dignity and worth of all human beings. He believed the Union cause was just, that preserving the nation and ending the institution of slavery were worthy goals. But he was also responsible for supporting his family, and the business he had built with Morris was their sole source of income. The law at that time allowed men who were drafted to pay for a substitute to serve in their place. It was a practice that favored the wealthy and created obvious inequities, but it was legal and accepted. John chose this option, paying $300 to hire someone to serve in the army in his stead. He also contributed money to help equip several other Union soldiers, supporting the war effort financially, even as he remained at home to manage his business. As it turned out, the war, for all its tragedy and horror, brought unexpected prosperity to Cleveland and to businesses like Clark and Rockefeller. The Union Army needed vast quantities of food to feed its soldiers. Grain, beans, meat, and other agricultural products were in constant demand. Prices rose sharply as the government became a massive purchaser of commodities. Cleveland's strategic location on Lake Erie, with good rail and water connections to both agricultural regions and eastern markets, made it an important hub for supplying the Union war effort. Clark and Rockefeller found themselves perfectly positioned to take advantage of this situation. Their business, which had been growing steadily, suddenly exploded. In 1862, just their second full year of operation, the firm cleared a profit of $17,000, an enormous sum for the time. Split between the two partners, it meant each of them earned more in a single year than most people made in a decade. For John, who had earned $50 in his first year at Hewitt & Tuttle, the transformation was almost dizzying. He was now 23 years old, and financially successful beyond anything he had imagined in those early days of rejection and 50-cent daily wages. The boy who had raised turkeys to help his family survive was now a prosperous merchant with a thriving business and a bright future. But even as Clark and Rockefeller flourished in the produce trade, John was becoming aware of another opportunity, one that would eventually eclipse everything he had accomplished so far. A new industry was emerging, one built on a substance that was being called black gold, and John D. Rockefeller was about to discover oil. To understand what was about to transform John's life, and indeed transform the world, we must step back and consider a problem that had plagued humanity since the beginning of civilization: light. For thousands of years, once the sun set, darkness fell. People relied on candles made from animal fat, on lanterns burning various kinds of oil, on open fires that provided both heat and light, but filled rooms with smoke. The wealthy could afford better lighting than the poor, but no one had truly satisfactory illumination after dark. By the mid-1800s, the most common source of lamp oil in America was whale oil, rendered from the blubber of whales hunted in the oceans around the world. Whale oil burned relatively cleanly and provided decent light, but it had serious drawbacks. It was expensive, available only to those who could afford it, and it required hunting whales, a dangerous occupation that was driving several whale species toward extinction. The whaling industry had become so intensive that some species of whales had been hunted nearly to the point of disappearance. Ships had to venture farther and farther from shore to find their prey. The cost of whale oil kept rising as whales became scarcer. It was clear that this could not continue indefinitely. Some alternative was needed. People had known for centuries that a dark, thick substance sometimes seeped out of the ground in certain places. Native Americans had used it for waterproofing and medicine. Settlers occasionally found it contaminating their water wells, but this substance, which came to be called petroleum or crude oil, seemed more like a nuisance than a resource. It was smelly, dirty, and difficult to work with. Then, in 1859, something changed. A man named Edwin Drake, working in Titusville, Pennsylvania, successfully drilled into the ground and struck oil at a depth of about 70 feet. This might not sound revolutionary, but it was. For the first time, instead of waiting for oil to seep naturally to the surface, people could actively extract it in industrial quantities. Drake used a tall wooden structure called a derrick to support his drilling equipment. The technique was simple but effective. Drilling straight down into the earth, he was able to tap into underground reservoirs of oil and bring it to the surface in amounts that made commercial production viable. News of Drake's success spread quickly, and it triggered something like a gold rush. Thousands of people descended on the oil regions of western Pennsylvania, hoping to make their fortunes. Towns sprang up overnight around successful oil wells. The landscape became dotted with wooden derricks, and oil production began in earnest. The timing was remarkable. Just as whale oil was becoming prohibitively expensive and ecologically unsustainable, here was an abundant alternative that could be extracted from the ground relatively cheaply. The oil boom had begun, and the substance was given an apt nickname, black gold. But there was a problem with crude oil as it came out of the ground. It was thick, smelly, and when burned in lamps it produced smoke and an unpleasant odour. People needed something better, something refined, and this is where the real opportunity lay. Not in drilling for oil, but in processing it. A young man named Samuel Andrews had discovered something important. He found that by applying sulfuric acid to crude oil through a careful chemical process, he could purify it and transform it into a substance called kerosene. When kerosene burned in a lamp, it lasted longer and shone brighter than crude oil, with far less smoke and smell. It was, in many ways, superior even to whale oil, and it could be produced much more cheaply. Andrews was a skilled chemist, but he lacked the capital and business experience to build a refinery on his own. He needed partners who could provide the money and manage the commercial side of the operation, and in 1863 he approached John Rockefeller and Maurice Clark with a proposal. Cleveland was ideally positioned for oil refining, even though it was not in the Pennsylvania oil regions themselves. The city had excellent railroad connections to Pennsylvania, so crude oil could be shipped there easily. It also had good access to eastern markets where refined oil could be sold, and there was a growing industrial infrastructure and skilled workforce that could support refinery operations. John and Maurice had money to invest thanks to the success of their produce business. The war had been very good to them, and they were looking for ways to diversify, to not put all their resources in a single industry. The oil business seemed promising, but it was also risky and unproven. They decided to proceed cautiously. They agreed to loan Andrews $4,000 to build a refinery in Cleveland, but they treated it as a side venture, something they would monitor but not actively manage. Andrews would handle the day-to-day operations of the refinery, while John and Maurice continued to focus on their produce business, which remained their primary source of income and their main concern. The refinery that Andrews built was remarkably simple by modern standards. It consisted of large vats where crude oil was heated, vessels where chemicals were added to purify it, and storage tanks for the finished kerosene. The process was not particularly complicated, but it required chemical knowledge and careful attention to get right. Andrews proved to be very good at it. The refined kerosene began to sell immediately, and sell well. People wanted this product. It was cheaper than whale oil, burned better than crude oil, and was becoming widely available as more refineries opened. The demand seemed almost limitless, as homes and businesses across the country were eager for better lighting solutions. Within a year, John could no longer ignore what the numbers were telling him. The oil refinery, which had started as a minor side investment, was generating more profit than the produce business that he and Maurice had spent years building. This was not a small difference. The refinery was significantly more profitable, and the gap seemed to be widening. John began to study the oil industry more carefully, trying to understand its economics and its potential. What he discovered fascinated him. The produce business was solid but limited. There were only so many people who needed grain and beans, only so much agricultural output in the region. But oil seemed different. The demand for kerosene for lighting was growing rapidly as the country expanded and industrialized. Everyone needed light. Every home, every business, every street lamp was a potential customer. Moreover, oil had international potential. Europe needed lighting just as much as America did. Ships could carry kerosene across the Atlantic, opening up vast new markets. The business could scale in ways that produce never could, but there were also serious challenges and risks. The supply of oil was wildly unpredictable and unstable. At this point, oil had only been found in one relatively small region of Pennsylvania. Many people believed it would run out soon, that the boom would be brief and those who invested too heavily would be ruined when the wells went dry. The pattern was always the same. Someone would strike oil, and within days an entire town would spring up around the well. Thousands of people would rush to the site, drilling wells as close together as possible, extracting oil as fast as they could pump it out. And then, just as quickly the oil would be exhausted, the wells would run dry, and the town would empty out as everyone moved on to the next strike. This created chaos in the oil market. When oil was abundant, prices would plummet, sometimes dropping to as low as 10 cents per barrel. That was less than the cost of the barrel itself, less than the cost of water. Refiners and producers would lose money on every barrel they produced. But then, when it seemed the oil was running out, prices would spike upward, sometimes reaching $14 per barrel or more. The swings were dramatic and unpredictable. John decided on a strategy to manage this volatility. He would stay out of oil production entirely. He would not drill wells or prospect for oil. That part of the business was too uncertain, too dependent on luck and geological factors beyond anyone's control. Instead, he would focus exclusively on refining. He would buy crude oil from the drillers and transform it into kerosene for sale. This helped somewhat, but it did not eliminate the problem. When oil was plentiful and cheap, refiners struggled to make a profit because their costs for labor and equipment remained constant, even as oil prices fell. And when oil was scarce and expensive, refiners feared they would soon have nothing to refine, that the industry would simply disappear. Maurice Clark found this uncertainty intolerable. He was a cautious man by nature, and the wild fluctuations of the oil market made him deeply uncomfortable. He began to have doubts about the whole venture. Perhaps they should stick with what they knew, with the steady, predictable produce business. Perhaps this oil boom was just a bubble that would burst, leaving them with worthless refineries and empty pockets. John saw things differently. Yes, the market was volatile. Yes, there were risks. But he believed in the fundamental premise of the business. People needed light, and kerosene provided it better and cheaper than any alternative. Even if the Pennsylvania oil fields ran dry, he believed other fields would be discovered. The need would drive exploration and oil would be found. The disagreement between the partners came to a head in 1865. They could not both be right about the future direction of the business. One of them needed to buy out the other. The question was, who would stay and who would go? They decided to settle it through an auction between themselves. They would bid against each other for complete ownership of the business, and whoever bid highest would take it all. It was a dramatic solution, but it was clean and final. The bidding began at a few $1,000s and climbed steadily. Maurice bid. John bid higher. Maurice bid again. The numbers rose. 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. Maurice's discomfort with the oil business was warring with his reluctance to give up the substantial asset they had built. Finally, John bid $72,500, equivalent to about $1.35 million in today's money. It was an enormous sum, more money than either of them had ever contemplated in their early days of struggling to build the produce business. Maurice considered the number, looked at his partner, and decided he had had enough. He accepted. He would take his money and leave the oil business to John. It was a pivotal moment. Maurice was cashing out at what seemed like a very good price, walking away wealthy and relieved to be free of the uncertainty and risk. John was doubling down, committing everything to an industry that many considered unstable and possibly short-lived. One of them was making a wise, prudent decision. The other was taking an enormous gamble. Time would reveal which choice had been wiser. But in that moment, in 1865, the paths diverged. Maurice Clark walked away from the oil business, and John D. Rockefeller became, at age 26, the sole owner of an oil refinery in Cleveland, Ohio. Within weeks of the buyout, vindication came. A massive new oil field was discovered in the Pennsylvania oil regions, one of the largest yet found. The fears about oil running out suddenly seemed premature. The supply was more abundant than anyone had realized. The industry had room to grow, and John Rockefeller was perfectly positioned to grow with it. The daily affirmation he had been repeating to himself for years was proving prophetic. He was indeed becoming rich, but this was only the beginning. What came next would be built on a foundation of strategic thinking, ruthless efficiency, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to succeed in a brutally competitive industry. In the midst of building his oil business, John took time to attend to his personal life. In 1864, he had married Laura Celestia Spellman, a young woman who shared his deep religious faith and Baptist convictions. They had met through church activities, drawn together by their common values and quiet, serious natures. Laura, known as Seti to her family and close friends, came from a family of modest means and strong principles. Her father had been active in the abolitionist movement, and she had grown up with a keen sense of social responsibility and moral duty. She was intelligent, well-educated for a woman of her era, and deeply committed to her faith. John and Seti established their household in Cleveland. Despite John's growing wealth, they chose to live modestly. They purchased a comfortable but not ostentatious house. They avoided the social scene that occupied many of Cleveland's wealthy families. John had no interest in being seen at fancy parties or belonging to exclusive clubs. His focus remained on his business and his family. With his home life settled and his business now entirely his own, John set about transforming his oil refinery into something larger and more ambitious. He renamed the operation Standard Oil, choosing the name to suggest reliability and consistency in an industry known for chaos and unpredictability. But John knew he could not manage this growing enterprise alone. He needed a partner, someone with business acumen and ambition to match his own. He found that person in Henry Flagler, a man who would become one of the most important figures in the Standard Oil story. Henry Flagler was similar to John in many ways. He was deeply religious, disciplined in his habits, and absolutely determined to succeed in business. Like John, he had known hardship and worked his way up from modest circumstances. But where John was quiet and reserved, Henry had a certain boldness, a willingness to be aggressive in pursuit of his goals. When John shared his vision for Standard Oil with Henry, explaining how he believed they could build the largest and most efficient refining operation in the country, Henry was immediately enthusiastic. This was not about making a little money or running a comfortable business. This was about building an empire, about dominating an entire industry. Henry wanted to be part of that. The two men discovered they shared a particular philosophy about business competition. Henry expressed it bluntly. Business was war. The goal was not just to succeed, but to crush the competition completely. There was no room for half measures or gentlemanly restraint. If you wanted to win, you had to be willing to do whatever was necessary to destroy your rivals. This might sound harsh, even ruthless, but both men would have argued that they were simply being realistic about the nature of business in their era. The oil refining industry was becoming crowded with competitors. New refineries were opening constantly. Many were poorly managed and inefficient, but they still competed for the same crude oil and the same customers. In such an environment, John believed only the strongest and most efficient would survive. John and Henry began to scheme, to plan strategic moves that would give Standard Oil decisive advantages over their competitors. They studied the economics of the industry carefully, looking for weaknesses they could exploit and opportunities they could seize. One of the most critical factors in oil refining was transportation. Crude oil had to be shipped from the Pennsylvania oil fields to refineries, and refined kerosene had to be shipped from refineries to markets in eastern cities and beyond. These transportation costs were substantial, and they affected every refiner's profitability. At that time, transportation meant railroads. There were no pipelines yet, no trucks or tanker ships for moving oil in bulk. Everything went by train, and 3 railroad companies dominated the routes that mattered for the oil industry: the New York Central, the Erie Railroad, and the most powerful of all, the Pennsylvania Railroad. The way these railroads' routes were laid out created different advantages for different refining centers. For the New York Central and the Erie Railroads, it made economic sense to carry oil to refineries in Cleveland. Their tracks ran in that direction, and Cleveland was a convenient hub for them. But for the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was the largest and most important of the three, the economics favored a different route. It was more profitable for them to carry oil directly from the Pennsylvania oil fields to the major eastern cities Philadelphia and New York, bypassing Cleveland entirely. In 1865, the Pennsylvania Railroad made a dramatic announcement. They declared that Cleveland would be, in their words, wiped out as a refining center. They were pulling out of the city completely, redirecting all their oil transportation to routes that bypassed Cleveland. This announcement caused panic among Cleveland's refiners. Many of them, seeing the writing on the wall, decided to relocate their operations to cities along the Pennsylvania Railroad's preferred routes. It seemed obvious that without access to the most powerful railroad in the country, Cleveland refiners would be at a fatal disadvantage. But the Pennsylvania Railroad's decision created a crisis for the other two major railroads. The New York Central and the Erie had made substantial investments in Cleveland, building infrastructure and establishing relationships with the city's refiners. Now, with the Pennsylvania Railroad leaving and many refiners following suit, these two railroads suddenly faced the prospect of losing much of their oil business. This was exactly the kind of situation that John had learned to recognize as opportunity. While others panicked, he saw leverage. The New York Central and Erie railroads were desperate for business. They needed oil shipments to make their Cleveland infrastructure profitable, and John, with his growing refinery operation, was in a position to give them exactly what they needed. John approached the Erie Railroad first with a proposal. If they would give him a substantial discount on their official shipping rates, he would guarantee them a consistent high volume of oil shipments. Instead of waiting and hoping for business from various refiners, they would have a steady, predictable flow of revenue from Standard Oil. The railroad's management was initially reluctant. Giving one customer such favorable rates seemed unfair to other shippers, but John pointed out the realities of their situation. They needed the business. Standard Oil could give it to them, but only if the economics made sense. The discount he was asking for was steep, a 75% reduction from the official rates, but the guaranteed volume would make up for the lower per-barrel revenue. The Erie Railroad agreed. Then John went to the New York Central with a similar proposal. In exchange for a daily order of 60 carloads of refined oil, Standard would pay $1.65 per barrel shipped, when the official rate was $2.40. Again, it was a significant discount, but the guaranteed consistent business made it attractive to the railroad. These deals, which came to be known as railroad rebates, were kept secret from Standard Oil's competitors. The official shipping rates remained $2.40 per barrel, and other refiners paid those full rates, unaware that Standard was getting a much better deal on the exact same trains. The advantage this gave Standard Oil was enormous. Transportation costs were a major expense for all refiners. By securing rates that were less than half what competitors paid, John had effectively given himself a massive cost advantage that others could not match. Because both the New York Central and Erie railroads now focused heavily on serving Cleveland with their oil transportation, and because they were incentivized to keep Standard Oil's business, Cleveland actually became a stronger refining center than it had been before the Pennsylvania Railroad left. The crisis that had driven other refiners away had made Standard Oil stronger. John now had a weapon he could use with devastating effect: the price war. Because he knew his transportation costs were lower than every competitor's, he could lower the price of kerosene and still make a profit. His competitors, paying full freight rates, would have to match his prices to remain competitive, but doing so would squeeze their margins or even force them to sell at a loss. John would drop his prices, and his competitors would be forced to follow. They would struggle, lose money, perhaps take out loans to stay afloat. John would wait patiently. Eventually, some competitor would run out of money or credit and go bankrupt. Standard Oil would then acquire their refinery, often for pennies on the dollar, and fold it into their growing empire. Once a competitor was eliminated, John would raise prices again, higher than before, and collect the profits. Then he would repeat the cycle with the next competitor. It was systematic, methodical, and extraordinarily effective. John was aware that these railroad rebates were, at minimum, ethically questionable. They gave large businesses enormous advantages over smaller competitors. They made it nearly impossible for new refiners to enter the market and compete on equal terms. In a sense, they undermined the principles of free competition that were supposed to govern American business, but John would have pointed out that at this time there were no laws against such arrangements. Antitrust legislation would not be passed for more than another decade. What he was doing was legal, even if it was aggressive, and in the rough-and-tumble world of the oil industry, where fortunes were made and lost with dizzying speed, where competition was fierce and often cutthroat, John saw no reason to fight with one hand tied behind his back. The strategy worked exactly as he had planned. Standard Oil grew rapidly, acquiring competitor after competitor, building additional refinery capacity, increasing efficiency, and steadily expanding its market share. The profits poured in, and John reinvested most of them back into the business, making it larger and stronger with each passing year. By the early 1870s, Standard Oil was no longer just another refinery in Cleveland. It was becoming the dominant force in oil refining, a company whose influence extended across the industry, whose decisions affected markets, whose growth seemed unstoppable. But growth and success also brought new challenges. The oil market remained volatile. Prices still swung wildly, and John had come to believe that the industry's problems could not be solved by any single company, no matter how large or efficient. The chaos needed to be addressed at a systemic level, and so John began to contemplate something even more ambitious than building a large company. He began to think about organizing the entire industry, bringing order to chaos, creating a structure that would stabilize prices and ensure profitability for those wise enough to join his vision. It would require secrecy, careful negotiation, and bold moves. It would make him powerful enemies and generate intense controversy. But John believed it was necessary, both for his own success and for the health of the oil industry as a whole. The foundation had been laid. Standard Oil was strong, profitable, and growing. The mechanisms of competition were understood and mastered. And John D. Rockefeller, still only in his early 30s, was ready to reach for something unprecedented, a monopoly over an entire industry. By 1872, John and Henry had built Standard Oil into a formidable operation, but the oil industry as a whole remained chaotic and unpredictable. Oil prices had fallen another 25% from their already low levels. Many refiners were struggling, and some were losing money on every barrel they processed. The situation seemed unsustainable. John had come to a conclusion that would shape everything that followed. The problem, he believed, was not just that individual companies were poorly managed or inefficient. The problem was structural, built into the very nature of the industry. There were too many refiners, all competing desperately for the same oil and the same customers. This oversupply drove prices down to the point where no one could make adequate profits. In his view, if the industry was facing a system-wide problem, it needed a system-wide solution. And that solution, he believed, was consolidation. If the major refiners and railroads could work together, coordinate their activities, and reduce the chaos of cutthroat competition, everyone would benefit through more stable prices and predictable profits. Around this same time, John received an unexpected overture from Tom Scott, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. This was the same railroad that had declared it would wipe Cleveland out as a refining center years earlier. Scott and John had been rivals of a sort, competing through their different strategies and alliances, but now Scott was reaching out with a proposal. Scott suggested forming a secret alliance between the largest railroads and a select group of the largest, most efficient refiners. This alliance would operate under an inconspicuous name, the South Improvement Company, or SIC for short. The name was deliberately bland and unmemorable, designed to avoid drawing attention to what was actually being proposed. The terms of the arrangement were extraordinary. In exchange for shipping all their oil exclusively through the member railroads, the select refiners, including Standard Oil, would receive a 50% rebate on transportation costs. This alone would give them an enormous advantage over refiners outside the alliance. But John, ever looking for ways to maximize competitive advantage, proposed an addition to the plan that was even more audacious. He suggested that the alliance should include what came to be called drawbacks. Under this arrangement, whenever anyone outside the alliance shipped oil on the member railroads, those railroads would pay a portion of that shipping cost to Standard Oil and the other alliance members. Let that sink in for a moment. Competitors of Standard Oil would not only be paying higher shipping rates themselves, but a portion of what they paid would go directly to Rockefeller. Their own transportation costs would be subsidizing their biggest competitor. It was a brilliantly ruthless mechanism that would make it virtually impossible for outside refiners to survive. There was more. The railroads agreed to provide Standard Oil with detailed information about competitors' shipments. John would know exactly how much oil each rival refiner was producing, where they were shipping it, and what routes they were using. He would have complete visibility into their operations while his own activities remained hidden from them. The SIC was structured so that anyone outside the alliance would be at a fatal disadvantage. They would pay double the shipping costs, subsidize their competitors through drawbacks, and have no knowledge of how the game was rigged against them. Meanwhile, the alliance members would enjoy reduced costs, additional revenue from drawbacks, and complete intelligence about the market. To John's critics then and now, this arrangement looked like a shameless power grab, an attempt to create an unbeatable cartel that would crush all independent refiners and establish complete control over the industry. And there is no denying the ruthlessness of the plan or the devastating impact it would have had on those excluded from the alliance. But John would have argued, and did argue when confronted about it later, that his intentions were not purely selfish. He genuinely believed that the oil industry was destroying itself through excessive competition. With so many refiners fighting over limited profits, the industry was heading toward widespread bankruptcy. By reducing the number of competitors and bringing discipline to the market, he was, in his view, saving the industry from itself. Whether one accepts this justification or sees it as self-serving rationalization is a matter of perspective. What is clear is that the SIC, had it succeeded, would have given Standard Oil and its allies unprecedented control over American oil refining. But the alliance was built on secrecy, and secrets of this magnitude are difficult to keep. Word began to leak out. People noticed that railroad rates had suddenly doubled overnight for some shippers. Independent refiners started comparing notes and realized something was happening, some kind of coordinated action that was working against them. When newspapers got hold of the story and began publishing details about the secret cartel, public reaction was swift and furious. Thousands of people took to the streets in protest. The oil regions of Pennsylvania erupted in anger. Town meetings were held where speakers denounced Standard Oil, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and everyone associated with the SIC. The protests were not merely verbal. Angry crowds hijacked Standard Oil shipments and deliberately spilled the oil onto the ground. They tore up sections of the Pennsylvania Railroad's tracks, physically preventing trains from operating. There were threats of violence against executives of both the railroad and the refining companies involved in the scheme. The oil producers, the men who actually drilled for oil in Pennsylvania, organized their own response. They declared a boycott of the SIC. They would not sell crude oil to Standard Oil or any of the other alliance refiners. Without a supply of crude oil, those refineries would have nothing to process, nothing to sell. The alliance would be strangled at its source. Faced with this overwhelming public backlash and the practical reality of the boycott, the South Improvement Company collapsed. It had existed for only about 2 months, from its formation in early 1872 to its dissolution in the face of public outrage. The grand plan to organize and control the entire oil industry had failed, at least in its initial form. For John, it was a humiliating setback. The SIC fiasco had brought intense negative attention to him and Standard Oil. His name was now associated with secretive schemes and unfair business practices. Many in the oil industry viewed him with suspicion and hostility. The failure seemed to suggest that his ambitions for industry-wide control were impossible to achieve. But John was not the kind of man to be deterred by a single defeat. If he could not control the oil industry through secret backroom deals with railroads, he would find another way. He would build his empire in plain sight, through direct acquisition and consolidation. If subtlety had failed, perhaps boldness would succeed. And here is where the Six's failure actually worked to John's advantage in an unexpected way. Despite the alliance being disbanded, rumors and fears about it persisted. Many refiners remained convinced that there must still be some secret deal in place, some hidden arrangement between Standard Oil and the railroads that gave Rockefeller an unbeatable advantage. This paranoia, this belief in a conspiracy that no longer actually existed, made refiners afraid and vulnerable. They worried that they were competing on an unlevel playing field, that Standard Oil had advantages they could not see or counter. And John decided to use that fear as a weapon. In a period that came to be known as the Cleveland Massacre, John launched an aggressive campaign to acquire his competitors. Over the course of just 6 weeks, he approached 26 oil refining companies in Cleveland with an offer to buy them out. His approach was straightforward but effective. He would show the owners of these companies Standard Oil's financial records, demonstrating how profitable and efficient his operation was. Then he would point out their own struggles, the losses they were taking, or the meager profits they were making. He would explain, often truthfully, that many of them were on the verge of bankruptcy anyway. And then came the implicit threat, never quite stated directly but impossible to miss. If they did not sell to Standard Oil, they would be crushed. John had the resources to outlast them in any price war. He had the efficiency to operate profitably, even when they were losing money. He had, they feared, those secret railroad deals that gave him insurmountable advantages. Fighting was futile. Selling was the only rational choice. Of the 26 refining companies John approached, 22 agreed to sell. Some sold for cash. Others accepted Standard Oil stock, becoming shareholders in the larger enterprise. The prices they received were often far below what their businesses had been worth in better times, but given the circumstances, many felt they had little choice. When a company sold to Standard Oil, John typically gave the owners 2 options. They could sign a contract agreeing never to re-enter the oil refining business, take their money, and walk away. Or they could join Standard Oil, bringing their expertise and knowledge into the growing organization. Many chose the second option, and this was actually brilliant on John's part. Instead of making enemies of these former competitors, he turned them into allies and employees. The men who had been running independent refineries, who understood the business and had their own expertise to offer, were now working for Standard Oil. The company was not just acquiring facilities and equipment, it was acquiring talent and knowledge. When Standard Oil took over a refinery, they immediately modernized it. They installed the latest refining technology, improved efficiency, and integrated it into their larger network of operations. Refineries that had been struggling became profitable under Standard's management. By mid-1873, the transformation was complete. Standard Oil now controlled virtually all of Cleveland's refining capacity. The company could process over 1 million barrels of kerosene per year. They had gone from being one large refiner among many to having a monopoly over one of the country's most important refining centers. And this was just the beginning. Cleveland was important, but it was not the only refining center in America. There were still significant competitors in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York. If John wanted to truly dominate the oil industry, he would need to extend his reach to those cities as well. But before he could continue his expansion, the nation was struck by economic catastrophe. On September 18, 1873, a day that came to be known as Black Thursday, a series of bank failures triggered a financial panic that plunged the entire country into a severe recession. It would last for 6 years and test every business in America, including Standard Oil. And yet, even in crisis, John would find opportunity. The recession that destroyed so many businesses would become the vehicle through which he would expand his empire far beyond Cleveland, building towards something unprecedented in American business history. The recession that began in 1873 was devastating in its scope and duration. Banks collapsed, taking depositors' savings with them. Businesses failed by the thousands. Unemployment soared. For the first time in the history of the oil industry, prices fell not because of oversupply, but because of a complete collapse in demand. People simply had less money to spend on everything, including kerosene for their lamps. By 1874, a barrel of oil was trading for as little as 48 cents, less than the cost of an equal amount of water. This was below the production cost for most refiners. They could not buy crude oil, refine it, and sell it at these prices without losing money on every transaction. The industry faced a wave of bankruptcies that threatened to sweep away even well-established companies. Standard Oil, however, was different. Thanks to years of careful financial management, they had excellent credit with banks and substantial cash reserves. Thanks to their modern, efficient refineries, their production costs were lower than most competitors. And thanks to their continued secret advantages with railroad shipping rates, their transportation costs remained manageable, while other refiners were drowning in red ink. Standard Oil continued to operate profitably, if not at the levels they had enjoyed during better times. They reduced their operations, running only the most efficient refineries and temporarily shutting down others. But they survived, and that survival positioned them perfectly for what came next. John looked at the bleak economic landscape and saw not disaster but opportunity. Refiners across the country were struggling. Many were on the verge of bankruptcy. All were desperate, and desperate businesses could be acquired for very little money. The recession, John realized, was his chance to expand Standard Oil's reach far beyond Cleveland. He initiated a nationwide campaign of acquisition. His targets were the struggling refiners in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York, the other major refining centers that had previously been beyond his control. He approached these companies with the same message he had delivered in Cleveland: sell to Standard Oil or face certain ruin. Some refinery owners were willing to negotiate and sell on reasonable terms, but others resisted, either out of pride or principle, or simple stubborn determination to maintain their independence. For these holdouts, John employed more aggressive tactics. One method was to buy up all available supplies of the equipment and materials needed to operate a refinery. He would purchase every barrel available for sale in a region, leaving competitors unable to package their kerosene for shipment. He would buy up refining machinery and parts, making it impossible for others to repair or expand their operations. Another tactic involved the railroads. Standard Oil would reserve every available railroad car for oil transportation for months in advance, paying for capacity whether they used it or not. This meant that even if a competitor somehow managed to produce kerosene, they had no way to ship it to market. Their product would sit in storage tanks, worthless, while Standard's goods moved freely to customers. John also used his detailed knowledge of competitors' operations, which the railroads continued to provide him, to time his attacks precisely. He would wait until a competitor was at their most vulnerable, perhaps when they had just taken out loans to survive another quarter, or when they had large shipments they needed to make. Then he would strike, using whatever pressure point would be most effective. Sometimes the pressure would be economic. Standard would offer to buy the struggling company, but at a price so low it was almost insulting. The message was clear: this is the best offer you'll get, and if you refuse, we'll make sure you get nothing when you inevitably go bankrupt. Other times, John would offer to save a competitor from bankruptcy by acquiring them, positioning himself as a rescuer rather than a predator. He would point out, often accurately, that he was offering them a way to preserve something from the wreckage of their business, whereas bankruptcy would leave them with nothing. The campaign was systematic and relentless. One by one, refineries fell into Standard Oil's orbit. By the time the economy began to recover in the late 1870s, The oil refining industry had been fundamentally transformed. Standard Oil controlled over half of Pittsburgh's refining capacity. They owned the largest refineries in Philadelphia. They had secured a dominant position in New York, but John was not content merely to dominate oil refining. He had come to believe that vertical integration was essential for long-term success. This meant controlling not just the refining process, but every step of the supply chain from oil wells to the final customer. Standard Oil began building an extensive network of pipelines. These pipelines would carry crude oil from the wells in Pennsylvania directly to their refineries, reducing their dependence on railroads and further lowering their costs. Refined kerosene would flow through other pipelines to storage facilities in major cities, ready for distribution to customers. The pipelines spread across the landscape like tentacles reaching out from Standard Oil's central hubs. This network gave the company extraordinary flexibility and control. They could move oil efficiently and cheaply, responding quickly to changes in supply or demand. And their competitors, who still relied primarily on railroad transportation, could not match these advantages. It was during this period of expansion that Standard Oil earned its nickname, the Octopus. The image was apt. Like an octopus with its many arms, Standard Oil seemed to be everywhere, reaching into every corner of the oil industry, tightening its grip on refiners, transporters, and distributors. By 1880, Standard Oil's dominance was overwhelming. They controlled approximately 90% of oil refining in the United States. In some regions, their control was even more complete. They set prices, they determined production levels, they decided which smaller companies could survive and which would be absorbed or destroyed. John D. Rockefeller, still only in his early 40s, had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America. The poverty of his childhood was a distant memory. The modest clerk who had earned 50 cents a day was now the head of an empire that dominated an entire industry. But this success came with a cost. Standard Oil's aggressive tactics had created many enemies. Refiners who had been forced to sell their businesses resented John and his company. Railroad executives who had been outmaneuvered in negotiations harbored grudges. Politicians began to take notice of the monopoly that had formed under their noses. The largest newspaper in America at the time published scathing editorials calling Standard Oil the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that had ever fastened upon a country. The company was becoming a symbol of corporate power run amok, of capitalism unchecked by any concern for fairness or competition. John remained largely silent in the face of this criticism. He did not give interviews or make public statements defending his business practices. He believed that his actions spoke for themselves, that the success of Standard Oil demonstrated the soundness of his strategy. He saw no need to explain himself to critics who, in his view, did not understand the complexities of the oil industry. But the criticism was not merely about past actions. New conflicts were emerging. Conflicts that would test Standard Oil's dominance and John's strategic abilities in ways the company had not yet faced. One of these conflicts would pit John against the most powerful corporation in America, a company that had until now seemed invincible. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which had once declared it would wipe Cleveland out as a refining center, which had been part of the failed South Improvement Company scheme, was about to become Standard Oil's most formidable opponent. And the battle between these two giants would have consequences that reached far beyond the oil industry. For railroad companies, the oil industry had been an unexpected gift. The transport of crude oil from wells to refineries and refined kerosene from refineries to markets generated enormous revenue. Trains hauled millions of barrels of oil every year, and the railroads made money on every shipment. It was one of their most profitable lines of business. But as Standard Oil built its network of pipelines across Pennsylvania and into other states, the railroads began to see a troubling future. Pipelines could move oil more cheaply than trains could. They operated continuously, required less labor, and did not need expensive locomotives and railway cars. As Standard's pipeline network grew, the company's dependence on railroads diminished. This was particularly worrying for Tom Scott, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the largest and most powerful railroad company in America. For years, the Pennsylvania Railroad had profited enormously from oil transportation. Now, one of their biggest customers was building infrastructure that would eventually make them obsolete for this purpose. Tom Scott decided to fight back. His strategy was bold and direct. If Standard Oil was moving into the pipeline business, then the Pennsylvania Railroad would move into the refining business. Scott began building his own refineries, positioning them to compete directly with Standard Oil. He also expanded his pipeline construction, hoping to create a transportation network that could rival Standard's. This was a declaration of war, and John recognized it as such. Tom Scott was not just another struggling refiner who could be pressured into selling. He was the head of America's most powerful corporation, with vast financial resources and political connections. This would be a different kind of battle, one that would require all of John's strategic skill. John's response was characteristically aggressive and multi-pronged. First, he immediately cancelled all Standard Oil business with the Pennsylvania Railroad. Every barrel of oil that Standard had been shipping on Pennsylvania trains was redirected to the other major railroads, the New York Central and the Erie. This sudden loss of business was a significant blow to the Pennsylvania Railroad's revenues. Next, John initiated a price war. Standard Oil lowered the price of kerosene significantly, knowing that Scott's new refineries, which were not as efficient as Standard's operations, would struggle to match these prices and remain profitable. Every barrel Scott's refineries sold at the lower price meant a smaller profit or possibly a loss. Then came an even more devastating move. John approached the New York Central and Erie railroads with a proposal. If they would drastically reduce their shipping rates for everyone, not just for Standard Oil, they would attract business away from the Pennsylvania Railroad. The reduced rates would hurt their own short-term profits, but the increased volume would make up for it, and it would cripple their competitor. The strategy worked exactly as John had planned. The New York Central and Erie railroads slashed their rates. Shippers who had been using the Pennsylvania Railroad switched to the cheaper alternatives. The Pennsylvania Railroad, trying to compete, was forced to match these lower rates, but doing so destroyed their profit margins on oil transportation. Tom Scott found himself in a terrible bind. To move oil through his own refineries and compete with Standard, he needed to use his own railroad. But to make the economics work, he was essentially having to pay himself to ship oil, and doing so at rates that were unprofitable. In some cases, he was actually paying other shippers to use his railroad, subsidizing them in a desperate attempt to maintain market share and keep his infrastructure utilized. The financial pressure on the Pennsylvania Railroad became unbearable. Scott had to make painful decisions. He laid off hundreds of workers, men who had families to feed and no other prospects for employment in the depressed economy. He cut the wages of the employees who remained by 20%, asking them to accept less money for the same work. These layoffs and wage cuts were not unique to the Pennsylvania Railroad. Other railroads, including the Baltimore and Ohio, were facing similar pressures and made similar decisions. The cumulative effect of these actions across the railroad industry was to create widespread anger and desperation among railroad workers. In July 1877, that anger exploded into violence. Railroad workers went on strike, refusing to work under the reduced wages and deteriorating conditions. But this was not a peaceful protest. Frustrated workers, some of whom had been pushed to the edge of starvation, turned to violence and destruction. What became known as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 spread across the country. In Baltimore, strikers clashed with militia, and several people were killed. In Pittsburgh, the situation deteriorated into outright warfare. Angry mobs attacked Pennsylvania Railroad property, destroying everything they could reach. The destruction in Pittsburgh was staggering. Rioters burned hundreds of railroad cars, destroyed over 100 locomotives, and set fire to dozens of buildings owned by the railroad. The flames could be seen for miles. The damage ran into millions of dollars. Dozens of people died in the violence, both strikers and security forces. John watched these events with growing concern. He had not anticipated this level of chaos. His war with the Pennsylvania Railroad had been intended as a business conflict, a strategic battle fought with prices and shipping rates, but it had contributed to conditions that sparked a social upheaval, violence that left people dead and communities traumatized. The strike eventually ended, put down by military force, and the slow exhaustion of the strikers who could not afford to remain unemployed indefinitely. But the damage was done, both to the railroads and to the social fabric of industrial America. It had demonstrated the human cost of the kind of ruthless business competition that John practiced. For Tom Scott and the Pennsylvania Railroad, the battle with Standard Oil had been catastrophic. The railroad had lost enormous amounts of money, its property had been destroyed, its reputation had been damaged, and most importantly, it had lost the war with John Rockefeller. Scott, desperate to salvage what he could, approached John to negotiate a settlement. The Pennsylvania Railroad could not continue to fight. It needed Standard Oil's business back. It needed to end this destructive conflict before it destroyed the company entirely. Henry Flagler, John's partner, saw this as an opportunity to completely crush the Pennsylvania Railroad. They had Scott exactly where they wanted him, beaten and desperate. Henry argued they should demand punishing terms, extract every advantage they could from their defeated opponent. But John took a different approach. He could have crushed Scott, certainly, but what would that accomplish? The Pennsylvania Railroad, despite its losses, was still a major corporation. It could still be useful to Standard Oil, and making Scott into a permanent enemy might create future problems. Instead, John negotiated a deal that gave Standard Oil everything it needed, while allowing the Pennsylvania Railroad to survive with some dignity intact. Standard Oil would guarantee 47% of its shipping business to the Pennsylvania Railroad, providing them with a steady, predictable source of revenue. The other major railroads, the New York Central, the Erie, and the Baltimore and Ohio, would share the rest. In exchange for this guaranteed business, John received substantial secret rebates on the Pennsylvania Railroad's official shipping rates. The railroad would provide Standard Oil with even more detailed information about competitors' shipments than before, and Standard would receive a payment of 20 cents for every barrel that moved through any of the railroads, even those shipped by competitors. The arrangement was similar to the failed South Improvement Company scheme from years earlier, but this time the balance of power was entirely different. Before, the railroads had been equal partners in a proposed alliance. Now John was dictating terms to defeated opponents. Standard Oil had become so large and powerful that the railroads needed it more than it needed them. This deal effectively made John one of the most powerful men in America. He controlled the dominant company in oil refining. He had favorable arrangements with all the major railroads. He had detailed intelligence about every competitor's activities, and he had the financial resources to outlast anyone who tried to challenge him. Standard Oil now controlled approximately 90% of oil refining in America. There were still a few scattered independent refiners, holdouts in various cities who had somehow managed to survive the consolidation, but they operated at the margins, unable to seriously threaten Standard's dominance. For Tom Scott, however, there would be no recovery. The battle with Standard Oil had broken him, both financially and physically. The stress of the conflict, the humiliation of defeat, and the destruction of the labor strike had taken a severe toll. Just a year after the settlement with Standard Oil, in 1878, Tom Scott suffered a stroke. He died shortly thereafter, at age 57, his health destroyed by the pressures of business warfare. There was a young man who had worked for Tom Scott years earlier, someone who had learned business from Scott and considered him a mentor. That young man's name was Andrew Carnegie, and he had gone on to build his own empire in the steel industry. Carnegie blamed John Rockefeller for Scott's death. The battle with Standard Oil, Carnegie believed, had killed his old friend and mentor, and so a new rivalry was born. Andrew Carnegie, who was becoming to steel what Rockefeller was to oil, now had personal reasons to oppose John. This was not just business competition, this was vendetta, the king of steel against the king of oil. Both men were determined to be the wealthiest and most powerful industrialist in America. This rivalry would shape both men's strategies for years to come. It would lead to conflicts and competitions that would influence entire industries. But it would also, in time, lead to an unexpected alliance, a partnership between former enemies that would prove profitable for both. For now, though, in the late 1870s, John Rockefeller had reached a pinnacle of power. Standard Oil's dominance seemed unshakable. His wealth was growing exponentially. His strategies had proven successful again and again, but the very success that made him powerful also made him a target. The public was becoming increasingly aware of Standard Oil's monopoly. Journalists were beginning to investigate the company's practices. Politicians were starting to pay attention to the concentration of economic power in one man's hands. The days of operating in relative obscurity were ending. John D. Rockefeller was becoming a public figure, whether he wanted to be or not, and the scrutiny that came with fame would eventually bring challenges he had never faced before. In 1879, just as Standard Oil seemed to have achieved total dominance of the oil industry, a new threat emerged from an unexpected direction. Thomas Edison, working in his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, successfully demonstrated a practical electric light bulb that could burn for hours without failing. The implications for Standard Oil were potentially catastrophic. The company's entire business model was built on providing kerosene for lighting. That was where the profit came from, where the demand originated. If Edison's electric light could replace kerosene lamps, the foundation of Standard Oil's empire would crumble. John watched Edison's progress with deep concern. Here was a threat that could not be bought out or competed against through price wars. This was technological innovation, a fundamental change in how people would light their homes and businesses. No amount of efficiency in refining or advantages in transportation could make kerosene competitive with electricity if the new technology proved superior. For many people in John's position, such a threat might have seemed insurmountable. Standard Oil was optimized for a world that burned kerosene. What would happen to all those refineries, all that infrastructure, all those investments, if the world no longer needed their primary product? But just as John was contemplating this existential threat to his business, a solution presented itself from an unexpected source. A Standard Oil chemist made a discovery that would transform the company's future and eventually transform the entire world. The problem began in the oil fields of Ohio. New wells had been discovered there, which should have been good news, but the oil coming out of these Ohio wells was different from Pennsylvania oil. It had a terrible smell, so bad that locals called it skunk oil. This odor made it virtually impossible to refine into usable kerosene. The smell remained even after processing, rendering the final product unmarketable. Standard Oil had invested in these Ohio fields, and now that investment seemed worthless. The oil was there, abundant and accessible, but unusable. John assigned his chemists to find a solution, to discover some way to remove the smell and make Ohio oil viable for kerosene production. After months of experimentation, one chemist succeeded. Through a careful chemical process, he was able to remove the sulfur compounds that caused the terrible odor. Ohio oil could now be refined into kerosene just as effectively as Pennsylvania oil. The investment was saved. The problem was solved. But in solving that problem, the chemist had noticed something else, something that had been treated as waste until now. When crude oil was refined into kerosene, there was always a lighter, more volatile byproduct that refineries simply threw away or burned off. This substance was called gasoline, and it had no commercial use. It was too explosive and dangerous to burn in lamps, and there was no other application for it. The chemist discovered that gasoline from the newly purified Ohio oil was of exceptional quality. It burned cleanly and with tremendous energy, but still there was no market for it. What good was a high-quality product if no one needed it? Then, in the late 1880s and early 1890s, inventors in Europe and America began experimenting with a new kind of engine. Instead of being powered by steam or by horses, these engines burned gasoline internally, using the explosive force of combustion to drive pistons. The automobile was being born. At first, automobiles were curiosities, expensive toys for wealthy hobbyists. But some visionaries, including a young man named Henry Ford, saw the potential for something much larger. Ford believed automobiles could be mass-produced and sold cheaply enough that ordinary people could afford them. If he was right, there would be an enormous demand for gasoline. John, despite his age, was still thinking decades ahead. While others dismissed automobiles as a passing fad, he saw the future. Standard Oil began stockpiling gasoline instead of disposing of it. When the automobile industry did take off, as John had predicted, Standard Oil was perfectly positioned to supply the fuel that would power this revolution in transportation. What had seemed like an existential threat from electric lighting became instead a transition to an even larger market. Kerosene sales would indeed decline as electricity spread, but gasoline sales would more than make up for the loss. Standard Oil's refineries, built to produce kerosene, could easily be adapted to produce more gasoline. The company's survival was assured. This ability to adapt and evolve, to see opportunities where others saw only threats, was one of John's greatest strengths. He never became complacent or assumed that current success guaranteed future prosperity. He was always looking ahead, always preparing for the next challenge or the next opportunity. But even as Standard Oil was securing its future in the oil industry, John was looking to diversify into other areas. He had long been interested in the iron ore deposits of the Mesabi Range in Minnesota. These deposits were among the largest in the world, and John believed they could be the foundation for another industrial empire. John began acquiring land and mining rights in the Mesabi Range, planning to build an operation that could supply iron ore to steel manufacturers. His timing seemed perfect. The American economy was industrializing rapidly, and the demand for steel was growing exponentially. Iron ore was an essential raw material for steel production, but there was a problem. One that involved his old rival Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie, who had built his own empire in steel production, also understood the strategic importance of the Mesabi Range, and Carnegie was not about to let Rockefeller enter the steel industry unchallenged. The rivalry between these two titans had been simmering for years. Carnegie blamed John for the death of his mentor Tom Scott. John saw Carnegie as a competitor and potential threat. Both men were accustomed to dominating their respective industries, and neither was willing to defer to the other. Carnegie made a bold move. He announced plans to build his own oil refinery in Pittsburgh. This was a direct challenge to Standard Oil, an invasion of John's territory by a man with the resources and determination to make it work. If Carnegie succeeded, he could use profits from steel to subsidize a price war in oil, potentially breaking Standard's monopoly. John countered by accelerating his plans for the Mesabi Range. He would not just mine iron ore, he would build his own steel production facilities. If Carnegie wanted to fight in oil, John would fight in steel. The stage was set for a monumental clash between America's two richest and most powerful industrialists. But then something unexpected happened. John's son, who had joined Standard Oil and was taking on increasing responsibilities in the business, approached his father with a different perspective. Why fight Carnegie when they could make a deal? Instead of waging a destructive war that would cost both men billions, why not find a way to cooperate? John Jr., as he was known, reached out to Carnegie through intermediaries. The message was simple. Both men could continue as they were, building competing operations and fighting expensive battles, or they could negotiate an arrangement that would benefit both. Carnegie was receptive. He was getting older, approaching retirement, and the prospect of a long, costly fight with Rockefeller was not appealing. Moreover, Carnegie was beginning to think about selling his steel company and moving on to other pursuits, particularly philanthropy. The two sides negotiated a deal. Rockefeller would sell his iron ore operations to a new company being formed to acquire Carnegie's steel business. This new company, which would be called United States Steel, would become the largest corporation in the world at that time. John would receive payment in the form of bonds and stock in this new company, making him one of its largest shareholders. Carnegie, for his part, would sell his steel company for $480 million, an astronomical sum that made him one of the richest men in the world. He would spend the rest of his life giving that money away, funding libraries, universities, and cultural institutions. For John, the deal represented something important. He had avoided a potentially ruinous conflict and instead converted his iron ore holdings into a profitable investment in the steel industry. He remained focused on oil, his core business, while maintaining a significant position in another vital industry. The deal was completed in 1901, and it marked a turning point. John was now in his 60s, and while he remained chairman of Standard Oil, he was gradually stepping back from day-to-day management. His son and other executives were taking over more of the operational decisions. John was beginning to think about his own legacy and his own future beyond business. He had achieved everything he had set out to achieve in business. Standard Oil was the most powerful company in its industry, perhaps the most powerful company in America. He had wealth beyond anything he could have imagined in those early days of poverty. He had proven himself to be one of the greatest business minds of his generation. But as John began to contemplate stepping back from active business, forces were gathering that would challenge everything he had built. Journalists were investigating Standard Oil's practices. Politicians were calling for action against monopolies. And public sentiment was turning against the concentration of economic power that companies like Standard Oil represented. The greatest test of John D. Rockefeller's life was not building an empire. It was about to be defending it against a nation that had decided his success had come at too high a cost to competition, to fairness, and to the American ideal of equal opportunity. In 1902, a woman named Ida Tarbell began publishing a series of articles in McClure's magazine, one of the most widely read publications in America. The series was titled The History of the Standard Oil Company, and it would change everything for John D. Rockefeller. Ida Tarbell was not just any journalist. She was one of the pioneers of investigative journalism, a meticulous researcher who spent years gathering documents, conducting interviews, and piecing together the story of how Standard Oil had risen to dominance. And she had personal reasons for her interest in the company. Tarbell's father had been an independent oil producer in Pennsylvania, one of the many small businessmen whose livelihoods had been destroyed by Standard Oil's aggressive tactics. She had grown up hearing stories about Rockefeller's ruthlessness, about the price wars and railroad rebates and systematic elimination of competitors. She had seen firsthand what Standard Oil's monopoly had cost ordinary people. But Tarbell was not content simply to express anger or make accusations. She was determined to document with facts and evidence exactly how Standard Oil had achieved its monopoly. She obtained internal company documents, interviewed former employees, and tracked down records of the secret deals with railroads. She built an ironclad case against the company. Her articles were devastating. Month after month, McClure's magazine published new installments, each one revealing more about Standard Oil's practices. The drawbacks, where competitors' shipping fees were paid to Standard. The industrial espionage, where Standard received detailed information about rivals' operations. The predatory pricing, where Standard would sell at a loss in one market to drive out competition, while charging higher prices elsewhere to subsidize the war. But perhaps most damaging was what Tarbell revealed about John's father, Devil Bill. She uncovered the truth about his bigamy, his life as a con artist, and the sexual assault allegations that had forced the family to flee Richford. These revelations about John's father were deeply humiliating. John had spent his entire adult life trying to build a reputation based on reliability and respectability. Now the public was learning about the shameful secrets of his family's past. The impact of Tarbell's series was enormous. Public opinion, which had already been skeptical of large corporations and monopolies, turned decisively against Standard Oil. Newspaper editorials called for action. Reform-minded politicians saw an opportunity to make their mark by taking on one of the most powerful companies in America. President Theodore Roosevelt, who had built his political career partly on a promise to rein in corporate power, saw Standard Oil as the perfect target. Roosevelt was a progressive who believed that monopolies undermined democracy and free enterprise. He had already earned the nickname Trustbuster for his efforts to break up large corporate combinations. In 1906, the federal government filed a lawsuit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law that had been passed in 1890 specifically to prevent monopolies and protect competition. The government's case was straightforward. Standard Oil had used illegal methods to eliminate competition and establish a monopoly over oil refining and distribution. The remedy sought was equally straightforward: break up the company. The legal battle that followed was one of the most significant in American business history. Over the course of several years, government lawyers and Standard Oil's legal team presented their cases. The trial generated more than 12,000 pages of evidence and testimony. Every aspect of Standard Oil's business practices was examined in minute detail. John himself was forced to testify, to answer questions about decisions he had made decades earlier, to explain and defend actions that he believed had been perfectly legal at the time. It was a humiliating experience for a man who valued his privacy and had always avoided public attention. The government presented evidence of railroad rebates and drawbacks, of predatory pricing and industrial espionage, of threats and intimidation used to force competitors to sell. Standard Oil's lawyers argued that these practices, even if they had occurred, were not illegal under the laws as they existed when the actions took place. They pointed out that Standard Oil had brought efficiency and innovation to the oil industry, that consumers had benefited from lower prices and better products. But the evidence was overwhelming. In 1909, the federal court ruled against Standard Oil. The company was found guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act through its systematic efforts to monopolize the oil industry. The court ordered that Standard Oil be broken up into 34 separate companies. Standard Oil appealed the decision to the Supreme Court, but in 1911 the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's ruling. The breakup would proceed. The company that John had spent more than 40 years building, that had become one of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world, would be dismantled by government order. For John, now 72 years old, the verdict was a bitter defeat. The government had declared that his life's work was illegal, that the empire he had built was a threat to the American economy and must be destroyed. It was a public repudiation of everything he had done, a judgment that his success had been achieved through methods that violated the law and harmed the public interest. But then something remarkable happened, something that must have seemed almost absurd to observers. The breakup of Standard Oil, which was intended to reduce John's wealth and power, actually made him richer than ever before. Here is how it worked. When Standard Oil was broken up, it was divided into 34 separate companies. Each company received a portion of Standard Oil's assets and operations, and John, as the largest shareholder in Standard Oil, received stock in each of these 34 new companies proportional to his ownership stake in the original company. Before the breakup, the stock market had valued Standard Oil as a single monopoly, but after the breakup, investors could buy stock in individual pieces of the company, choosing the ones they thought had the best prospects. This created competition among the successor companies, and it turned out that investors valued these separate companies more highly than they had valued the monopoly. Some of these successor companies became household names. Standard Oil of New Jersey eventually became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. These companies competed with each other, but they also thrived independently, growing and innovating in ways they might not have done as parts of a single monopoly. The stock price of these companies soared. Within months of the breakup, John's shares in the successor companies were worth far more than his stake in the original Standard Oil had been. By 1913, just 2 years after the breakup, The value of his holdings had roughly tripled. John D. Rockefeller, who had already been extraordinarily wealthy, now became the first billionaire in American history. His fortune was estimated at about $1 billion, equivalent to roughly $25 billion in today's money. Adjusted for inflation and as a percentage of the total American economy, his wealth at that time was greater than that of any individual before or since. The irony was inescapable. The government had tried to punish John for building a monopoly, and the punishment had made him the richest man who had ever lived. The breakup that was supposed to diminish his power had instead multiplied his wealth. His enemies had inadvertently given him the ultimate victory, but wealth alone could not erase the damage to John's reputation. He was vilified in the press, portrayed in political cartoons as a grasping octopus or a pirate stealing from the public. Children were taught in school that he was an example of greed and ruthless ambition. His name had become synonymous with the worst excesses of capitalism. For a man who had tried to live according to his religious principles, who had always tithed and supported his church, who had genuinely believed that his business practices were justified and even beneficial, this public condemnation was deeply painful. He had become one of the most hated men in America at the same time he had become the richest. And so John, in the final decades of his life, faced a question that would define his legacy. He had achieved unimaginable success in business. He had accumulated unimaginable wealth. But what would he do with that wealth? How would he be remembered? Was there a way to redeem his reputation and find meaning in his final years? The answer would come not from business, but from giving, and the scale of his giving would be as unprecedented as the scale of his business empire had been. John D. Rockefeller's approach to philanthropy began long before he became a billionaire, long before Standard Oil dominated the oil industry, even before he had any significant wealth to give away. From his very first paycheck as a 16-year-old clerk earning 50 cents a day, he had given approximately 10% of his income to charity. This practice of tithing was rooted in his Baptist faith and his mother's teachings. But as his wealth grew from hundreds to thousands to millions and eventually to billions of dollars, John's giving grew proportionally. What began as a few pennies from each paycheck eventually became one of the largest philanthropic endeavors in human history. In the early years, John's charitable giving was local and personal. He donated to his church, to schools in Cleveland, to organizations that helped the poor. He supported the education of formerly enslaved people in the South, funding schools and colleges that provided opportunities to Black Americans in an era of pervasive racism and discrimination. But as his wealth reached levels that were difficult to even comprehend, John began to think about philanthropy in a different way. Simply writing checks to various causes, while generous, seemed almost random and inefficient. He began to believe that giving away money wisely required the same kind of strategic thinking and careful planning that had made him successful in business. In 1897, John met a man named Frederick Gates, who would transform his approach to philanthropy. Gates was a Baptist minister who had impressed John with his intelligence and organizational abilities. John hired Gates initially to manage his charitable giving, but Gates became much more than that. He became John's advisor and partner in creating a new approach to philanthropy. Gates argued that charity should not be about simply giving money away. It should be about solving problems at their root causes. Instead of giving food to hungry people, which provided temporary relief but changed nothing fundamental, philanthropy should address why people were hungry in the first place. Instead of treating sick people, philanthropy should fund research into preventing and curing diseases. This approach, which came to be called scientific philanthropy, resonated deeply with John. He had always believed in efficiency and systematic approaches to problems. Why shouldn't those principles apply to giving money away just as much as to making it? Together, John and Gates established the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913. This organization would serve as the vehicle for John's philanthropic vision, funding initiatives in public health, medical research, education, and scientific advancement around the world. One of the foundation's first major initiatives was the campaign against hookworm in the American South. Hookworm was a parasitic infection that afflicted millions of people, particularly poor rural communities. It caused chronic fatigue, stunted growth in children, and contributed to the cycle of poverty and poor health. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, established in 1909, worked to eradicate hookworm through a combination of public education, improved sanitation, and medical treatment. The campaign treated over 1 million people and dramatically reduced the incidence of the disease. For the first time, people saw that public health problems could be addressed systematically and solved on a large scale. Encouraged by this success, the Rockefeller Foundation expanded its public health efforts internationally. They fought against yellow fever in Central and South America. They funded research into malaria and other tropical diseases. They established schools of public health and trained doctors and nurses around the world. In China, the foundation established the Peking Union Medical College, which became one of the leading medical institutions in Asia. In medical research, Rockefeller funding supported the work that led to the development of the yellow fever vaccine, to treatments for meningitis, and to countless other medical advances. The impact of these initiatives was measurable in millions of lives saved and improved. Diseases that had killed or disabled vast numbers of people were brought under control. Medical knowledge advanced at an accelerated pace. Healthcare improved in communities around the world. But medical and public health were not John's only philanthropic interests. He was also deeply committed to education. Over his lifetime, he gave enormous sums to establish and support universities, colleges, and schools. The University of Chicago became one of John's signature educational projects. The university had been founded in 1890 with a substantial donation from Rockefeller, and he continued to support it generously throughout his life. His total contributions to the University of Chicago exceeded $80 million, a staggering sum for the time. That investment transformed what had been a struggling institution into one of the world's leading research universities. The University of Chicago would go on to produce numerous Nobel Prize winners and make groundbreaking contributions to fields ranging from economics to physics to social sciences. John also supported Spelman College, a historically black women's college named after his wife's family. He funded schools across the American South that provided education to black students who were otherwise denied access to quality schooling. He contributed to dozens of other educational institutions, believing that education was fundamental to individual opportunity and social progress. All told, over the course of his life, John D. Rockefeller gave away approximately $540 million, equivalent to roughly $7 billion today, though that comparison understates the true scale because it does not account for the much smaller size of the economy and total wealth in his era. As a percentage of his total wealth, John gave away more than half of everything he had accumulated. He died wealthy, still a billionaire, but he could have died far wealthier if he had kept everything for himself and his family. This creates a profound paradox when we try to evaluate John D. Rockefeller's life and legacy. How do we reconcile the ruthless businessman who crushed competitors and built a monopoly through practices that were eventually declared illegal, with the philanthropist who gave away hundreds of millions of dollars and whose donations saved countless lives and advanced human knowledge? Some would argue that his philanthropy was an attempt to buy redemption, to whitewash a reputation earned through ruthless business practices. They would point out that the money he gave away was made through methods that harmed competitors, exploited workers, and undermined fair competition. Others would counter that, regardless of how the money was made, the good it did was real and substantial. The lives saved by medical advances funded by Rockefeller money were no less valuable, because that money came from oil profits. The students educated at Rockefeller-funded institutions were no less deserving of opportunities because their scholarships came from monopoly proceeds. John himself seemed to struggle with this tension throughout his later years. He never expressed regret about his business practices, never apologized for building Standard Oil or using the tactics he employed. He believed, or at least claimed to believe, that he had operated within the law and that his success benefited society by bringing efficiency and innovation to the oil industry. But he also seemed aware that his business career had made him a controversial and often despised figure. His turn to philanthropy, while rooted in lifelong religious convictions about stewardship and charity, was also clearly an attempt to shape how he would be remembered. In his final years, John lived quietly at his estates in New York and Florida. He played golf, spent time with his family, and continued to oversee his philanthropic work through the Rockefeller Foundation. He maintained his routines and his disciplines, still the same methodical, controlled person he had been in his business career. He watched as the oil industry he had dominated continued to grow and evolve. The automobile revolution he had predicted had indeed come to pass. Henry Ford's Model T and other affordable cars were transforming American society, and all those cars needed gasoline that came from oil, refined by the successor companies to Standard Oil. He lived to see his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., become a major philanthropist in his own right, continuing and expanding the family's charitable work. Junior, as he was called, would eventually give away even more than his father had, funding the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, donating the land for the United Nations headquarters in New York, and supporting countless other causes. And he lived long enough to see his reputation begin to shift slowly, from that of a robber baron to that of a great philanthropist. The hatred that had been so intense in the early 1900s gradually faded as memories of the Standard Oil monopoly receded, and the impact of Rockefeller philanthropy became more visible and widely recognized. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, just weeks before his 98th birthday. He had lived an extraordinarily long life, spanning nearly a century of dramatic change in America and the world. He was born in a world of candlelight and horse-drawn carriages, and he died in a world of electric lights and automobiles. At the time of his death, newspapers around the world published obituaries and reflections on his life. Some emphasized his business achievements and the empire he had built. Others focused on his philanthropy and the good his donations had done. Most acknowledged that he was a complex and contradictory figure who defied simple moral judgment. Perhaps the fairest assessment is that John D. Rockefeller embodied both the promise and the dangers of American capitalism in the Gilded Age and Progressive era. He demonstrated what ruthless ambition and strategic brilliance could achieve in building a business empire. He also demonstrated the social costs of unchecked monopoly power and the need for regulation to protect competition and fairness. His philanthropy established a model for how great wealth could be used for public benefit, influencing generations of wealthy individuals who followed. Andrew Carnegie, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and many others have cited Rockefeller as an inspiration for their own charitable giving. The institutions he funded continue to do important work more than a century after his death. The University of Chicago remains a world-class research institution. The Rockefeller Foundation continues to support public health and development projects around the world. The research he funded contributed to medical advances that have saved millions of lives, and the industry he dominated, while no longer controlled by any single company, remains fundamental to the modern world. Oil and its refined products power our transportation, heat our homes, and serve as raw materials for countless products we use every day. When we think about John D. Rockefeller today, we confront questions that have no simple answers. Was he a villain who exploited workers and destroyed competitors, or a visionary who brought efficiency and innovation to a chaotic industry? Was his philanthropy genuine altruism, or calculated image management? Can we separate the good he did from the methods he used to acquire the wealth that made that good possible? Perhaps the most honest answer is that he was all of these things. A human being of enormous talent and drive, who operated in a particular time and place, who made choices that brought both tremendous benefits and real harm, and who ultimately tried to use his wealth in ways that would benefit others. The story of John D. Rockefeller is not just the story of one man. It is the story of American capitalism itself in a formative period, with all its energy and innovation, all its excesses and abuses, all its capacity for both great achievement and great injustice. And so we leave him here, at the end of his long life, having risen from poverty to become the richest man in history, having built an empire and seen it broken apart, having been both celebrated and reviled, having given away a fortune and left a legacy that remains deeply complicated and impossible to reduce to any simple judgment. The boy who raised turkeys to help feed his family, who repeated to himself each morning that he was bound to be rich, who worked tirelessly and strategically to build something unprecedented, did indeed achieve everything he set out to achieve and more. Whether that achievement represents triumph or tragedy, progress or exploitation, heroism or villainy, may depend less on any objective truth than on which aspects of his story we choose to emphasize, and how we weigh the competing values of innovation, fairness, efficiency, and justice that his life brings into conflict. What remains indisputable is that John D. Rockefeller changed the world. The oil industry, American business practices, modern philanthropy, and countless lives touched by his donations all bear his mark. And the questions his life raises about wealth, power, responsibility, and legacy continue to resonate in our own time. And so we come to the end of our journey through the life of John D. Rockefeller. Over these past 3 hours, we have traveled from a small farmhouse in upstate New York to the boardrooms where empires were built, from poverty to unimaginable wealth, from obscurity to a prominence that brought both acclaim and condemnation. Whether you have stayed with us for the entire journey, or drifted in and out as sleep called to you, or found yourself somewhere in between waking and dreaming, we hope this story has given you something to consider, something to reflect upon in your own time. The life of John D. Rockefeller reminds us that human lives resist simple categories of good and evil, success and failure, right and wrong. We are all complex beings, capable of great achievements and serious failings, often simultaneously. We make choices based on the circumstances we find ourselves in, the values we hold, and the ambitions that drive us. Rockefeller's story is, in many ways, uniquely American. It speaks to themes that have defined this nation: ambition and opportunity, innovation and competition, the pursuit of wealth and the responsibility that comes with it, the tension between individual success and collective fairness. But it is also a deeply human story, one that transcends any particular time or place. The questions it raises about how we measure success, about what we owe to others, about how we reconcile our ambitions with our values, about what kind of legacy we hope to leave, these are questions every thoughtful person must wrestle with in their own way. As you rest now, as you let these thoughts settle, remember that you too are writing your own story. The choices you make, large and small, are shaping the person you will become and the impact you will have on the world around you. May your choices be guided by wisdom, tempered by compassion, and aligned with your deepest values. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening to this remarkable story of ambition, achievement, controversy, and redemption. May you rest well, and may you wake refreshed, ready to write your own next chapter. Good night.